Sir Ada wars that last decades, wars that swallow generations whole, wars that begin with one man's ambition and end with an entire civilization's ruin. We know those wars, we study them, we build museums to contain them. And then there is this one, a war that began before most people had finished their morning tea, a war that ended before the smoke had cleared from the first cannon shot. A war so brief, so strange, so asymmetric in every conceivable way that historians who first encountered it in the archives assumed they had misread the dates. They had not misread the dates. On the morning of August 27, 1896, on the eastern coast of Africa, on a small island that most people in the world had never heard of and could not have located on a map, the British Empire declared war on the Sultanate of Zanzibar. The bombardment began at 9 o'clock and 2 minutes in the morning. It was over by 9:40, 38 minutes, perhaps 45, depending on which account you read and whose clock you trust. It is listed in the Guinness World Records as the shortest war in recorded human history. But here is the thing about short wars. They are never really short. The events that produce them, the ambitions, the resentments, the calculations of power, the human lives caught in the machinery those 10 years to build, sometimes decades. The fighting lasts 38 minutes. The history behind the fighting lasts much longer, and the history behind this one is darker, stranger, and more human than the record books have ever captured. To understand what happened on that August morning, you have to go back, not just a few years. You have to go back to the very nature of what Zanzibar was, and what it meant to the empires and the men who wanted to control it. Zanzibar is an archipelago, a collection of islands sitting in the Indian Ocean off the coast of what is today Tanzania. The main island Unguja is about 90 kilometers long and 32 wide at its broadest point. From the eye it looks like a green jewel dropped into a turquoise sea. From the water it smells of cloves. Zanzibar produced cloves in such quantities, for so long, that the scent became part of the island's identity. Sailors navigating the Indian Ocean could smell Zanzibar before they could see it. But Zanzibar was not only about cloves. For centuries, Zanzibar had been one of the most strategically important trading posts in the entire Indian Ocean world. Arab traders, Indian merchants, Portuguese explorers, and eventually British and German imperial agents had all recognized what the island was, a gateway, a node in the network of trade routes that connected East Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, the Indian subcontinent, and beyond. Whoever controlled Zanzibar controlled a significant piece of the economic architecture of an entire ocean. And for much of the 19th century, Zanzibar had also been the center of one of the most brutal slave trades in the world. The Arab slave trade operating out of Zanzibar moved human beings from the interior of East Africa to the markets of the Arabian Peninsula, Persia, and the Indian subcontinent. At its height in the mid-19th century, somewhere between 40,000 and 50,000 enslaved people passed through Zanzibar's markets every single year. The numbers are almost impossible to process. They represent individual human lives, men, women, and children seized from their homes in the interior, marched to the coast under conditions of extraordinary brutality, and sold. The British Empire, which had abolished the slave trade in its own territory in 1807 and slavery itself in 1833, had a complicated relationship with the slave trade operating out of Zanzibar. Complicated because Britain also had strategic interests in the island. Complicated because the Sultans of Zanzibar, the Omani Arab dynasty that ruled the island, were useful partners in the broader project of British influence in the region. Complicated because the reality of empire is always that moral principles and strategic interests compete, and strategic interests have a way of winning. But the pressure on Britain to act against the Zanzibar slave trade was real and sustained. The missionary David Livingstone, whose expeditions into the interior of Africa had exposed the slave trade to British audiences in visceral and undeniable terms, had turned the issue into a moral cause that the British public cared about. When Livingstone died in 1873, the cause acquired a martyr. That same year, under sustained British diplomatic pressure, Sultan Barghash of Zanzibar signed a treaty abolishing the slave trade. The famous slave market in Zanzibar's stone town was closed. An Anglican cathedral was built on its site, a deliberate, symbolic act that the British found enormously satisfying. But abolishing the slave trade on paper and dismantling the economic and social structures that had been built around it over centuries were very different things. The trade continued in modified and hidden forms. The economic relationships that the trade had built did not simply dissolve because a treaty had been signed. And the political relationship between Britain and the Sultanate of Zanzibar, a relationship of nominal independence, practical dependence, and steadily deepening British control, continued to evolve. By the 1880s, that evolution had accelerated dramatically, because Europe had entered its age of competitive imperialism. The scramble for Africa had begun. The scramble for Africa is one of the most extraordinary events in modern history. In the space of roughly 2 decades, between the early 1880s and the early 1900s, the European powers carved up an entire continent among themselves. They drew lines on maps with rulers, with no more reference to the people, languages, cultures, or political structures that existed on the ground. They established colonies, protectorates, spheres of influence, and administered territory with a confidence in their own right to do so that, examined honestly, is almost incomprehensible. Britain and Germany were the two dominant players in East Africa, and Zanzibar sat at the center of the competition between them. Germany had arrived in East Africa with characteristic efficiency and ruthlessness in the 1880s, establishing what would become German East Africa, the territory that is today Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi. The German colonial agent Karl Peters had secured treaties with interior chiefs by methods that even other European imperialists found questionable. The German presence on the East African mainland was expanding rapidly. Zanzibar was the prize that both powers wanted, or at least wanted the other not to have. For Britain, the island was a strategic asset and a symbol of its dominant position on the East African coast. For Germany, control of Zanzibar would have been a serious blow to British regional influence. The resolution came in 1890 in the form of the Heligoland-Zanzibar Treaty. Britain ceded the small North Sea island of Heligoland to Germany and received, in return, German recognition of a British protectorate over Zanzibar. It was a transaction that reflected the cool transactional logic of imperial diplomacy. Two European powers dividing up pieces of the world between them, with no more consultation of the people who actually lived there. From 1890, Zanzibar was formerly a British protectorate. The Sultan remained on his throne. The ceremonial apparatus of the Sultanate continued to function. But real power rested with the British President, a senior British official on the island whose approval was required for any significant political decision, whose advice the Sultan was expected to follow, and whose backing was essential for any Sultan who wanted to remain Sultan. The British President was, in effect, the ruler of Zanzibar. The Sultan was a face. A useful face. A face that gave the arrangement of an air of indigenous legitimacy that made it easier to administer. And then, in the summer of 1896, the face decided it wanted to be something more than a face. His name was Khalid bin Barghash. He was young, in his mid-20s. He was the nephew of the Sultan who had just died, Hamad bin Tuwaini, who had died on August 25, 1896, and their circumstances that raised questions that were never fully answered. Hamad had been in good health. His death was sudden. So were those who suspected poison. So was never proof. What so was, within hours of Hamad's death, was Khalid. He moved quickly. Before the British resident, Basil Cave, had been officially notified of the Sultan's death, Khalid had entered the palace with several hundred armed supporters and declared himself Sultan. He had the palace guard. He had the palace weapons. He had the initiative. What he did not have was British recognition. And in a British protectorate, British recognition was the only recognition that mattered. The treaty that governed the protectorate was clear on this point. No more new Sultan could take power without British approval. The British had a preferred candidate, Hamad bin Mohammed, a man they considered reliably cooperative and politically manageable. Khalid knew this. He also knew that if he waited for the British to manage the succession, he would not be Sultan. So he did not wait. Basil Cave sent Khalid a message. The message was diplomatic in its language and unambiguous in its meaning. Khalid did not have British recognition. Khalid should step down. If Khalid did not step down, there would be consequences. Khalid sent back a message of his own. He had the support of his people. He was the rightful Sultan. He would not step down. Cave was not a man who responded well to defiance. He was a product of the British imperial system, a system that had spent the better part of a century establishing the principle that defiance of British authority in the colonial world was not merely futile but impermissible. He sent a second message, more direct, more pointed. Khalid had received letters from German officials suggesting, not entirely clearly, that Germany might be sympathetic to his position. This was, in retrospect, a catastrophic misreading of the situation. Germany had recognized the British protectorate in 1890. German officials in Zanzibar were not going to risk a diplomatic crisis with Britain over the ambitions of yang Maninapelis. But Khalid heard what he wanted to hear. He believed he had German backing. He did not. He began to fortify the palace. He assembled his forces. He brought the palace's ancient cannon to the waterfront. He positioned his men, and he ran up the Sultanate's red flag over the palace roof, a gesture whose symbolism was not lost on the British warships sitting in the harbor. Those warships, let us talk about those warships. The British Indian Ocean Squadron was not a casual presence in Zanzibar harbor. At the time of the crisis, the harbor contained 5 British warships: HMS Philomel, HMS Thrush, HMS Sparrow, HMS Akun, and HMS Street George. These were not symbolic vessels. They were armed. They were crewed by trained men. They carried guns that could reduce the palace to rubble in a matter of minutes. Against these, Khalid had the palace building, several hundred men, a collection of rifles and older weapons, and a single vessel of any significance yet called the Glasgow, which had been given to the Sultanate as a gift and which Khalid's men had armed as best they could and positioned in the harbor. The disparity was not subtle. It was not the kind of military situation that invites careful strategic analysis. Any rational assessment of the correlation of forces would have arrived at the same conclusion instantly. This was not a war that Khalid could win, not in any conventional sense. But Khalid was not, perhaps, conducting a purely rational analysis. Or perhaps he was conducting a rational analysis of a different kind, an analysis that concluded that backing down would be humiliating and permanent, while resistance, even doomed resistance, would at least be resistance. So there is a kind of logic in choosing to be defeated rather than choosing to submit. It is not military logic, but it is human logic. In London, the Foreign Office was following the situation with the calm attention of an institution that had handled imperial crises on 5 continents. Instructions were sent to Kiev. The British position was clear. Khalid must stand down. If he did not stand down by 9 o'clock on the morning of August 27, the warships would open fire. The ultimatum was delivered. The deadline was set. August 26 passed. Khalid did not stand down. The night before the bombardment, inside the palace, there must have been conversations happening that no more record has fully captured. What did Khalid say to the men around him? What did they say to him? Did anyone urge him to surrender while there was still time? Did anyone believe, even that night, that something would intervene? A diplomatic message? A German ship? A change of heart from the British? We do not know. We have the outline. We do not have the inside of that night. What we have is the morning. August 27, 1896. Zanzibar Harbor. 9 o'clock in the morning. The harbor would have been extraordinary in the early morning light. The Indian Ocean at that hour, that latitude, has a particular quality of light, intensely bright, slightly hazy. The water a deep blue-green that catches the sun in a way that makes everything look almost unreal. The white cattle buildings of Stone Town would have been gleaming. The palace, positioned near the waterfront, its red flag still flying, would have been clearly visible from every British ship in the harbor. At 9 o'clock and 2 minutes, the British ships opened fire. What followed was not a battle in any traditional sense. It was a bombardment. The British ships poured fire into the palace and the surrounding structures with the systematic efficiency of a military machine that had been doing this kind of work for a very long time. The palace's defenses, such as they were, returned fire. The ancient cannon on the waterfront managed a few shots. The Glasgow, Khalid's armed yet, attempted to engage. A British shell found the Glasgow almost immediately and she sank in shallow water, her crew scrambling to reach shore. The men inside the palace were dying. Khalid's forces were estimated at somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 men. The number of casualties in the bombardment has been documented as approximately 500 killed or wounded. 500 men in 38 minutes. The mathematics of it are stark and terrible. The palace did not simply sustain damage. It was destroyed. The structure that had stood as the seat of Zanzibari power, that had housed sultans and their courts, that had been the center of political and ceremonial life on the island for generations, was reduced to rubble and fired in the time it takes to watch a television program. At 9:40, Khalid's red flag came down. Whether it was shut down or deliberately lowered is a detail that different accounts give differently. What is certain is that it came down. What is certain is that Khalid himself, at some point during those 38 minutes or in the immediate aftermath, slipped out of the burning palace and made his way, with a small group of followers, to the German consulate. The German consulate, the institution he had believed would support him, he was now a refuge within its walls. The Germans gave him shelter they could not, under diplomatic convention, refuse, but they could not give him what he actually needed, which was recognition and power. He would remain in the German consulate for several years before eventually being allowed to go into exile in German East Africa. He died in 1927 in Mombasa, far from the palace whose ruins by then had been cleared away and built over. He died as a man who had once been Sultan for 2 days. The British installed Hamud bin Mohammed as Sultan immediately after the bombardment. Hamud was everything Khalid was not, from the British perspective: cooperative, reasonable, willing to take advice, willing to implement policies that the British resident recommended. One of the first major policies implemented under Hamud's rule, under sustained British pressure, was the formal abolition of slavery in Zanzibar. The slaves were freed. The legal institution of slavery in the Sultanate of Zanzibar was ended. It is a fact that deserves to be stated plainly and without irony. The British, who had just destroyed a palace and killed 500 people to install a sultan of their choosing, used that installation to end slavery on the island. The moral accounting here is genuinely difficult. The means were brutal. The end was real and significant. The people who were freed from legal bondage were real people whose lives were genuinely changed. History rarely offers clean moral equations. Zanzibar in 1896 offers a particularly complex one. But there is another dimension to the abolition story that the triumphant British narrative tends to gloss over. The abolition of the legal status of slavery did not immediately or automatically transform the lives of the people who had been enslaved. The economic structures that had produced slavery, the cloth plantations, the land ownership patterns, the social hierarchies, did not evaporate with the legal change. Many of the people who had been slaves continued to work the same land, for the same landowners, under economic conditions that were technically free but practically constrained. Freedom on paper and freedom in daily life are different things. The British knew this. The Colonial Office in London knew this. The reports from British officials in Zanzibar in the years after 1896 document the gap carefully and with a frankness that the public communications of the era did not always match. The shortest war in history ended in the formal liberation of enslaved people. And that liberation was real and incomplete and complicated all at once. Let us return to the 38 minutes. Because those 38 minutes have a quality to them, when you sit with them, that rewards extended attention. Think about what 38 minutes means in the context of human conflict. The First World War lasted all for 4 years and killed approximately 17 million people. The Second World War lasted 6 years and killed somewhere between 70 and 85 million. The 100 Years' War, the series of conflicts between England and France that gives the period its name, lasted, in its various phases, from 1337 to 1453, 116 years. The conflict that goes by that name involved multiple generations of soldiers and rulers, each of whom was born into a war they had not started and died before it ended. 38 minutes. There is something almost philosophically vertiginous about the disparity. The same human capacity for organized violence that produced the Somme, that produced Stalingrad, that produced the firebombing of Dresden, that same capacity also produced this. A conflict so brief that the men who began it were still alive and uninjured when it ended. A conflict that was, in its speed, almost more light in execution than a war. And that comparison is not entirely unfair, because the outcome was never genuinely in doubt. The British naval officers who gave the order to fire on the morning of August 27 knew, with near certainty, what the result would be. They were not uncertain about victory. They were not even particularly anxious about the process. This was a problem to be solved with firepower, and they had firepower, and the problem would be solved. The men inside the palace knew it too. On some level, they were not fools. They could see the warships. They could count the guns. They knew that the cannon on the waterfront and the small arms in the palace were not going to stop what was coming. And yet they stood. 500 of them died for a cause that was already lost before the first shell fell. That fact is worth sitting with. Not as a judgment, not as an argument that they should have surrendered when they had the chance, but as a recognition of something that the Guinness World Records entry does not capture. The brevity of this war does not make it trivial. It makes it stranger, more concentrated, more revealing of something essential about what war actually is. War is the application of organized force by one group of people against another group of people to achieve a political objective. That is the clinical definition. The clinical definition is accurate but inadequate, because the people inside the palace on that August morning were not variables in a political equation. They were men with names and families and reasons for being so. They were men who had made choices, some of them probably bad choices based on miscalculations and bad information and the particular blindness that comes from wanting to believe something is possible when it is not. But they were men, and they died in 38 minutes. The British press covered the event with the slightly amused tone that the British press of the late Victorian era reserved for imperial incidents that confirmed the established order of things. The war was not a cause for alarm or moral reflection. It was a curiosity, a record, a demonstration of British efficiency and the futility of resistance to British power. There was something almost performative about the coverage. The speed of the victory was taken as evidence not just of military superiority but of a broader civilizational superiority, the idea that the British Empire was so advanced, so powerful, so rationally organized that even its wars were efficient. The message to any other potential troublemakers in the protectorate system was clear. This is what happens. This is how quickly it happens. It is worth noting what was not in the British press coverage. The 500 men who died in the palace and in the harbor, the families of those men, the broader population of Zanzibar that had watched the bombardment from a distance and now had to make sense of what they had seen. The experience of the island itself, not as a strategic asset or a diplomatic puzzle but as a place where people lived and where something violent and definitive had just occurred. The survivors of the bombardment did not leave extensive written records, for the same reasons that survivors of imperial violence rarely do. Their accounts are in oral tradition, in the memory of communities, in sources that the British colonial archive was not designed to preserve. Historians working in the post-colonial era have recovered some of this, but the recovery is incomplete. The archive is asymmetric. The British side is extensively documented. The Zanzibari side is partial, fragmentary, and recovered with difficulty. This asymmetry is not accidental. It is a product of who controlled the means of documentation. It is a product of whose perspective the recording apparatus of the era was built to capture. And it is one more reason why the 38 minutes, understood fully, is a more complex and darker story than the record books suggest. Basil Cave, the British resident who had issued the ultimatum and overseen the bombardment, was seen as having handled the affair efficiently. He was praised. He continued his career. The imperial machinery recognized his work as competent and moved on. The British naval officers who had commanded the ships were similarly unremarkable in the history that followed. They had done their jobs. Their jobs had been done well. There was nothing unusual about that, from the perspective of an empire that had been doing this kind of thing for a very long time. The deeper irony of the Zanzibar situation became apparent over the following decades, as the British protectorate ground on through the early 20th century. The cooperative sultans installed by British preference proved, over time, to be no more stable or permanently manageable than the inconvenient ones. The political, economic, and social tensions on the island did not resolve themselves simply because the British had demonstrated the consequences of resistance. The clove economy went through cycles of boom and collapse. The racial and class hierarchies that had been built around the Arab landowning elite and the African and South Asian laboring population created resentments that accumulated over generations. The formal end of slavery had not produced genuine economic equality. The promises of colonial improvement, better governance, better infrastructure, better life outcomes were delivered unevenly and always in the context of an arrangement that ultimately served British strategic and economic interests rather than the interests of the people who lived there. In 1963, Zanzibar gained independence from Britain as a constitutional monarchy under the last Sultan. In January 1964, the Zanzibar Revolution, violent, bloody, and racially targeted, overthrew the Sultanate entirely. The Arab ruling class was expelled or killed. The island was transformed and then merged with Tanganyika to form Tanzania. The revolution of 1964 is its own story, one with its own darkness and its own complications. But it is impossible to understand 1964 without understanding the structures that had been built over the preceding century, the structures of the slave trade, of British imperial management, of economic inequality and racial hierarchy. Those structures had roots that went back well before August 27 ke 1896. But August 27, 1896 was a node in the system. A moment when those structures were violently enforced and temporarily stabilized. The 38 minutes were not the beginning of the story, and they were not the end of it. It is a particular kind of historical record, clean, compact, easily digestible, that the Guinness World Records entry represents. The shortest war in history, Agust 27 ke 1896, 38 to 45 minutes. Britain versus Zanzibar. Britain wins. It is the kind of fact that you can repeat at a dinner party. The kind of fact that makes people look up from their plates and say, really? It has the quality of trivia. Interesting, contained, finished. Real history resists that containment. Real history has the texture of human lives behind it, the ambitions and miscalculations of Khalid bin Barghash, the cold strategic competence of Basil Cave, the 500 men who died, the enslaved people who were freed, the generations of Zanzibaris who lived with the consequences of that morning. Real history has context that trivia does not. The Indian Ocean trade routes, the Arab slave trade, the scramble for Africa, the Heligoland-Zanzibar Treaty, the long and entangled relationship between British moral pressure and British strategic interest. None of that fits in a record book entry, but all of it is true. All of it is part of what the 38 minutes actually were. So it is a question worth asking, at this point in the story, about what it means to call this a war at all. International law in 1896 had a relatively clear, if not universally applied, definition of war, a conflict between sovereign states. Zanzibar, as a British protectorate, occupied an ambiguous position. It was nominally a sovereign sultanate with its own ruler and its own flag. It was practically a dependent territory whose sovereignty was managed and constrained by the protecting power. Whether the Anglo-Zanzibar War was a war between two sovereigns or a punitive military action by a colonial power against an uncooperative client is a question that legal scholars and historians have debated. The classification matters for reasons beyond the purely academic. If it was a war, then it has that record. If it was a punitive bombardment, then it is something else, something that sits more plainly in the category of colonial violence rather than in the almost light-hearted category of historical curiosity. The people who call it the shortest war have, for understandable reasons, leaned into the language of war. The record is more interesting than the alternative framing, but the alternative framing is fair, and it is not unreasonable, and it changes the moral color of the 38 minutes in ways that deserve acknowledgement. There is a place in Zanzibar's stone town today called the Palace Museum. It occupies the site of the Beit al-Sahel, the palace that was destroyed in the bombardment of ke 1896. The current building was constructed after the bombardment, and it now houses exhibits on the history of the Sultanate and the island. If you visit the museum in Zanzibar, is a place that rewards visiting, for its extraordinary beauty, its layered history, its spice-scented streets and cattle architecture, and the way the Indian Ocean light falls on everything. You can see artifacts from the Sultanate period, ceremonial items, documents, photographs. The bombardment is not the centerpiece of the museum. It is a chapter in a longer story, as it should be. Outside the museum, on the waterfront, the harbor where the British ship sat on that August morning is now used by fishing boats and tourist ferries. The water is still that extraordinary blue-green. The light is still that particular Indian Ocean intensity. History accumulates in places. It does not disappear. It changes shape, gets built over, gets incorporated into new structures and new narratives. But it is there. The harbor holds its memory of the ships and the guns. The museum holds its memory of the sultans. The streets of Stone Town hold, in their architecture and their names and their spatial organization, the memory of the slave trade and the Arab Empire and the British colonial presence and everything that came after. 38 minutes happened in a place that had centuries of history behind it and decades of history still ahead. Compressed into that specific half hour were the logic of empire, the fragility of sovereignty without poverty but it, the human cost of miscalculation, and the strange mercy of the ending of a legal institution that had caused immeasurable suffering. All of that, 38 minutes. Let us think about Khalid bin Barghash for a final moment. Not as a symbol, not as a historical actor whose decisions led predictably to a predictable outcome, but as a person. He was 25 years old, roughly, when he walked into that palace and declared himself Sultan. He had watched his family exercise power for his entire life. He had grown up understanding the Sultanate as a real institution, as a source of real authority, even as the British protectorate steadily drained that authority of substance. He knew that the British preferred someone else. He made his move anyway. Was he brave? In a sense, obviously yes. He faced down British warships. He did not run before the bombardment began. He stayed in the palace until the palace was uninhabitable. So it is a kind of courage in that. Whatever else you think of the decision, was he foolish? In retrospect, again obviously yes. The miscalculation about German support was catastrophic. The belief that the British would back down under pressure was wrong. The willingness to stake the lives of thousands of his followers on that belief was, at minimum, a decision whose consequences he bore more lightly than the men who died. But people in the middle of history do not have the perspective of retrospect. They have the information they have, the beliefs they hold, the incentives that are operating on them. Khalid had information that turned out to be wrong. He had beliefs about German support that turned out to be wishful thinking. He had every incentive to fight because the alternative was permanent political marginalization. He made his choice. The choice ended in fire and ruin. He spent the rest of his life in exile. He died a long way from home. A man who had been Sultan for 2 days, remembered primarily as a footnote in a record book. History is full of men like this. Men who reached for power at the wrong moment, miscalculated the forces arrayed against them, and paid prices that were both personal and collective. They are rarely the heroes of the stories told about them. They are usually the cautionary tale, the example of what happens when you challenge the established order without sufficient means to bat the challenge. But they are also, sometimes, more than that. Sometimes they are the last person to hold a position before that position ceases to exist entirely. Khalid was not just a failed pretender to a throne. He was, in some sense, the last authentic expression of Zanzibari sovereignty before that sovereignty was definitively reduced to a fiction. After Khalid, the sultans who followed were administrators of British policy, not rulers of an independent state. The form of sovereignty continued. The substance had been shelled into rubble on August 27, 1896. The shortest war in human history lasted 38 minutes. That is the sentence that trafos. That is the fact that gets repeated, that ends up in books of records and trivia collections and internet lists of surprising historical facts. Behind that sentence is a harbor and 5 warships and a young man in a palace making a choice he could not win. Behind it is the Indian Ocean Trade Network and the Arab slave trade and the machinations of European imperial competition. Behind it is 500 people dying in less time than it takes to watch a television program. Behind it is the liberation of enslaved people in circumstances that were as violent as they were overdue. Behind it is the whole complicated, layered, morally unresolved human reality of the age of empire, an age that shaped the world we live in now in ways that we are still in the process of understanding. 38 minutes. The record books have it as a curiosity. It was a human event. It had human consequences. And the people who experienced it, the people who fought and died and were freed and watched from the shore and made their decisions in the smoke and the firelight, they deserve to be understood as more than a footnote. The shortest war in history was still a war, and was, however brief, leave marks that do not disappear in 38 minutes. They last much, much longer than that.